Hi, it's Danielle Karupkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit for webyeshiva.org, and we are studying Moreh Nevukhim. This is the week before Rosh Hashanah, so I know that a number of people are focusing their thoughts on the new year and preparing for something truly monumental on the Day of Judgment. But we try to be consistent as possible to be able to go through the Rambam's text. And so today is no exception. I hope that you'll be able to extract certain things from the chapter today that will help you over the high holidays. But we'll see. What we're going to do today is finish off chapter 49. It is quite a lengthy chapter. It is the last chapter where the Rambam deals with his exposition over the past 14 chapters on Ta'amei HaMitzvot, on the reasons that he feels are why God gave us the commandments, how each one of the 613 commandments helps a human being reach the apex of his or her humanity through the perfection of the intellect, which can be accomplished by perfection of behavior, by diversion from negative thoughts and negative behaviors, all towards that common goal that a Jew is meant to focus their attention exclusively upon God, God's creation, to be able to achieve that level of attachment that only a human being is capable of achieving. And so, what we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to run through what is actually quite a lengthy handout for today. This is Moreh Nevukhim, chapter 49 of the third section, part 2, where we're going to be focusing on, among other things, Arayot and circumcision. Arayot is the term for those forbidden relationships that are described in Leviticus chapter 18, including incest, bestiality, and homosexuality. Now, in the first part of this chapter, the Rambam put forward his general thesis that the Torah seeks to curtail man's sexual activity in order that he will be able to focus on the primary objective of human life, perfecting the intellect. It goes without saying, and this is something that the Rambam had said explicitly in his Shmona Prakim, in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, in his Mishnah commentary, that so long as man is focused on physical self-indulgence, it is a distraction. It is something that pulls him away from this goal. To that end, he discussed the institution of marriage, divorce, the sota, cases of seduction, rape, and slander, and yibum, levirate marriage. The Rambam very much believes that there is an additional ethical component to sexual laws, which is something that we saw last week, which teach man to respect the object of his sexual encounter and treat her with dignity and respect. We now continue, and that was actually what we see throughout this chapter, is that the Rambam stays focused on this theme that the Torah has a set of laws that seek to curtail man's sexual activity and sexual obsession, but at the same time, the Rambam has provided us with several sidebars that add additional enhancements to the objectives of these mitzvot. And one of them, which I thought was quite progressive for the Rambam, is that the Torah places penalties and requirements upon every man to treat a woman with respect and dignity in the course of that sexual relationship that a man has with a woman. That's why the Torah creates the institution of marriage, and that's why it requires an individual who abuses a woman sexually to compensate her for that disregard. We now continue with the laws of Arayot, which we had started last week, further designed to curtail man's sexual appetite. Last week, the Rambam addressed homosexuality and bestiality, which the Rambam grouped together, explaining that both acts were unnatural and performed purely for sexual gratification without any other utility, presumably being that there's no procreation or marriage and formation of family that results from those two activities. And for that reason, the Rambam said that it was pretty much self-evident as to why the Torah completely forbids those two sexual encounters, homosexual encounters, and bestial encounters. We had just started talking about forbidden relatives, and we had started off by saying, and we're just going to recap for today, that as to those prohibited female relatives, such as a sister, a mother, a daughter, a grandmother, etc., they all have one thing in common. These females are mostly women who are easily accessible to the male, his having grown up with them in the same family, and his ability to seduce them is also therefore easier. And as a result, if the Torah were not to prohibit a man from having sexual encounters with his relatives, it would cause him to succumb completely to his sexual drive because all of these women would be available to him so readily. If the Torah, so that's what, but once the Torah prohibited these relationships with the strongest of penalties, that is to say, death and or karet, men are turned away from this set of women who are most physically accessible to them. Thus, the first reason for prohibiting arayot, these relatives, is to curtail man's sexual activity. And now the Rambam gives us a second reason, bottom of page 606, top of page 607 in the Pines edition. He says the second reason for prohibiting incest is to preserve man's sense of shame and humility. Now, this is let's just go through the text. Let's see what he actually says, and then we'll try to analyze it as best as we can. He says that it is inherently impudent, and the Ibn Tibon uses the term azut, which is the term for impudence, and Kafich uses the word chutzpah. But it is impudent, it is brazen for a man to sexually encounter both the root and the branch. That's the terminology that the Rambam uses to explain why incest is prohibited. That is, a family is compared to a tree, and a chaste and modest person should only take one fruit from a tree and not indulge fully in the other fruits of the same tree. And that is why all forms of incest are prohibited, not only a mother and son and a father and a daughter, but also brothers and sisters, because they're all from the same tree. Also included is a third party, a man from a different family who wants to take both a mother and a daughter as his wives. The Torah prohibits that, again, taking two fruits from the same tree. Also included is the prohibition to marry one's aunt or uncle, since they are extensions of one's father or mother. By contrast, cousins are sufficiently unrelated to allow such unions. And then the Rambam says, well, according to that logic, why then does the Torah permit not only to marry one's cousin, but the Torah permits also to marry one's niece or nephew? An aunt may, an uncle may marry his niece, even though a nephew may not marry his aunt, but an uncle may marry his niece. For this, we must return to the first reason, says the Rambam, to curtail man's sexual encounters with women easily accessible to him. In other words, the Rambam says, I will grant you the argument of taking two fruits from one tree may not easily apply because they're sufficiently distant, but he says the first reason is still applicable in that we want to curtail man's sexual encounters with women easily accessible to him. A young adult male is more likely to frequent his aunt's home than a man frequenting his niece's home. And that is why even one's uncle's widow or one's aunt's widower is prohibited, even though there's no blood relation, that is, they're from a different tree. And so the idea that the Rambam is conveying is that number one, the Torah wishes to curtail man's sexual activity, so those people whose homes he frequents most because of family connections, the Torah prohibits, such as an aunt. A man may not marry his aunt, but because an uncle is not typically going to frequent his niece's home, it is therefore more permissible for him to marry her, and it's not a violation of taking two fruits from one tree because she's sufficiently distant from him, just as two cousins, even first cousins, are sufficiently distant from each other. Now, to give a little bit of an analysis of this, and this is where we have to sort of conjecture a little bit as to exactly what kind of chutzpah is involved in taking two fruits from the same tree. The Rambam doesn't really clearly explain this, and I had difficulty finding some really a lot of classic commentary that really discusses this. Why is there something impudent in accessing fruit from the same tree? At face value, it seems like the Rambam views this as an act of gluttony, or I think actually a better word, and the more I think about it, is a form of exploitation, in that a refined person should not ravage a tree of all of its fruit, or even take more than one fruit per tree, especially if he has a whole orchard of trees from which to choose. I guess you could say it's common derech eretz, it's common courtesy not to strip a tree bare when you have other trees that you can choose from. And there's a certain refinement of character that's involved to be sensitive to the tree itself or to the family itself, not to take excessive advantage of one family and allow there to be a circulation for others as well. I was noting Rav Toledano's sefer on Moreh Nevukhim, and he seems to say that it has to do with the upsetting of genetics. That if you marry a relative of yours, you're going to risk mixing up relatives who could cause a genetic failure, a genetic mutation. But that's a circular argument, since God could have created nature differently, allowing incestuous encounters to result in healthy genetics. So I'm not really sure that I fully appreciate or understand his commentary on that. So it would seem to me that it's more of an ethical teaching, not having to do with the playing with science, but rather having to do with the fact that an ethical person looks at even non-human entities, such as a family unit or a tree, and says, when I indulge and I allow myself to exploit the fruit of that tree or the fruit of that family, let me leave plenty of fruit for everybody else, and I'll only take one for myself. It's a sort of an act of modesty, or an act of, I guess, chasteness, I guess you could say. Now we go on to another topic. Now that we've talked about the topic of Arayot, let's talk about the Nidah and the married woman, who, for some reason, the Rambam has a very terse statement putting the two of them in the same category. He says the reason for both of these women being forbidden is too clear to be in need of a search for a reason. I'm just giving you the exact quote from the Pines edition. And if I might be allowed to just analyze that statement for a minute, we can certainly understand the prohibition of a married woman, in that this violates the ethical aspect of Arayot and involves a form of betrayal and theft of taking someone else's woman, also creating a disruption in the family unit. As the Rambam had started off the chapter by saying that the institution of marriage is to create intact families. And if a man were to commit an act of adultery, you would have you wouldn't know who belongs to which family, and that would be very, very problematic. So there's an ethical aspect to it. There's a breakdown of family. So that seems to be quite self-apparent. But what of nidah? What is self-evident about its prohibition? That a woman who is menstruating is forbidden to have a sexual encounter with a man. Perhaps the Rambam views the nidah in the same way he views homosexuality and bestiality above, that there is no utility to this union because when a woman is menstruating, she cannot become pregnant. Although one could certainly draw distinctions. I don't think that the Rambam would say that it's prohibited to have relations with a pregnant woman, even though there's no utility of her getting pregnant from that. The Rambam would certainly maintain, or a woman who's postmenopausal. There's no prohibition of a man and a wife having physical intimacy just because there's no utility in that sense. So it would seem that there's more to it than that. And we could examine the Ramban's commentary on the prohibition of nidah, which he says in a few places in his Torah commentary, such as in Leviticus chapter 12, which talks about the laws of childbirth. He says, "V'hanachon be'enai, ki ha'isha bimei ri'iyata tikarei nidah." Why is the term for a menstruating woman nidah in Hebrew? The Ramban tells us that the word nidah comes from the word nidoi, to be under a ban, to be excluded or ostracized from the community. And the Ramban has almost not only a social commentary on the nidah, but also a mystical understanding of her level of tumah, that there's something ontological there, that even her breath should be avoided because something emits from her that is harmful, noxious to other human beings. Now, if you recall, the Rambam in his treatment of other religions had taught us that in the laws of nidah, the Torah is actually much more compassionate and accepting of the nidah than other religions who would ostracize a woman and make her seem like she was contaminated to the entire community. Ironically, the Ramban says that the reason why a woman who's a nidah is forbidden is because she should be viewed as someone who's contaminated in some way. He talks about not only her breath, he talks about if she steps on things, she will contaminate them. Va'af mabat shala molid hezek, even when she looks at certain things, she causes damage. And so it could very well be that the Rambam, in part at least, subscribes to something that the Ramban is saying, is that because of the fact that her body is filled with blood, it would not be appropriate for a man to conjoin with her at that time because this is the blood of ritual contamination. The only problem that I have with that is that we know that the Rambam does not agree that Tuma has some kind of ontological contamination that adheres to it. And we talked about this before, based on his previous commentary of Tuma being a non-inherent designated status. So I just want us to think about this. The Rambam feels that the prohibition of the nidah is self-evident. It could be because it doesn't result in procreation, which isn't completely satisfactory. It could be because having intimacy with a woman who's actively bleeding is something that is repugnant to an individual, either because of the tumah attached to that blood or just because it's instinctively repugnant and unseemly to a person. But let's go on. The prohibition of sexual thoughts and arousal is what the Rambam raises next. And the Rambam makes a note of saying that I've already talked about these ideas in Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah, the part of the Mishnah Torah where the Rambam codifies this idea that it is prohibited for a man to spill his seed gratuitously. And he talks about the prohibition of masturbation and also having sexual thoughts which will lead to the spilling of seed. So just to very, very quickly give you a snippet of those halachot, the Rambam in Mishnah Torah writes in chapter 21 of Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah, Asur lahotzi shichvat zera levatala. It is forbidden for a person to spill his seed gratuitously. And we won't go into that whole halacha. He talks about different types of ways that a person could do it physically. V'chein asur la'adam sheyiksha atzmo ladat or yavi atzmo lidei hirhur. It is also forbidden for a person to cause himself to have an erection or to have sinful thoughts and indulge in those sinful thoughts. Ela im yavolo hirhur yasia libo midivrei havai v'hashchata lidivrei Torah. What should a person do if he finds himself overcome with thoughts of sexuality? He should engage instead in Torah study. Shehi ayelet ahivim v'ya'alat chen, because that is, to quote scripture, something that is your best friend and will allow you to be alleviated from any of that negativity. And then he says, "V'lo yistakel b'vehema u'v'chaya va'of b'shah shemizdakekim zachar l'nekeva." Related to this, a person is also not permitted to look at animals when they are in heat and when they are copulating with each other. We're going to hold off on this underlying portion because it's going to be relevant to a halacha that we're going to confront in just a moment. But he also writes in halacha chaf aleph, v'chein asur la'adam lihistakel b'nashim b'sha'a shehein omdot ala kivisa. It is furthermore forbidden to look at women when they are in compromising states of undress, such as when they're by the river rolling up their sleeves and doing the laundry. Because this could potentially cause a person to have sinful thoughts. Finally, he says, Misha paga bi isha b'shuk. Even if a person meets up with a woman in the marketplace, aslo lahalech achareha, he's not allowed to walk directly behind her. He either has to run in front of her or he has to walk to the side of her. And he continues along this theme that this is the act of a ruffian, of a commoner, and that's not something that a person should do. And then the Rambam continues after saying that I've already treated this issue of spilling seed and having sinful thoughts in Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah. He then quotes our sages from Tractate Kiddushin, because our sages call the evil inclination that part of my psyche that fills me with sinful thoughts of sexuality, a menuval, a vile one or a disgusting one. As the Talmud says, Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael, Bini impaga becha menuval zeh, if this vile one confronts you, attacks you, so to speak, moshcheu lebeit hamidrash, drag him to the study hall. Im even hu nimoach, if he is like a rock, the rock will melt. V'im barzel hu mitpotzetz, and if he's like iron, the iron will splatter, or it'll break apart. And then the Talmud quotes scripture to bear that out. The concept of the evil inclination being so abominable, says the Rambam, is truly wondrous in the Rambam's eyes. It says it's truly amazing. It is so apt because when you look not only at the words of the sages, but you read the works of the great philosopher Aristotle, you will find him talking about the same idea, that there is a part of my intellect that leads me astray, and I have to try to subjugate it, subdue it, and so forth. Aristotle has written about the evils of the sense of touch, which arouses passions for food and sex, as I have already presented in this work. If we go back to section 2, chapters 36 and 40, where the Rambam discusses how a person prepares for prophecy, the person who would aspire to be a prophet has to divest himself from those thoughts. And in this section, chapter 8, when discussing the evils of matter in general and how a person should strive to strip away matter from his life, the physicalities of life, and focus more on the form, the spiritual components. And the Rambam says, I maintain that this is the reason why the Torah prohibits the crossbreeding of animals, because this type of husbandry involves handling the animal's sexual organs and being involved in their copulation. The Rambam says this activity is unnecessary for animals of different species. I just want to make a point of saying that let's go back now to our text in Mishneh Torah. The Rambam says explicitly that even though you're not allowed to look at two animals when they're in heat copulating, he says, Mutar lemarbi'ei behema lahachnis kemichol bishvoferet mipnei shehein asukin b'melachtan. The Rambam says it is perfectly fine for a farmer who's involved in animal husbandry to help the animals along and cause them to have coitus so that they can reproduce, even to the point of where the farmer manually inserts the male organ into the female organ. Why is that permitted if we're worried about sinful thoughts? Because this is part of his job. Lo yavo lidei hirur, and therefore he's not going to come to sinful thoughts. So the Rambam says, but I feel that the prohibition of crossbreeding animals is something that's gratuitous. You don't need to crossbreed animals. And therefore, this is sort of like an extension, even though it's permitted to perform animal husbandry in the way that we just described, but you shouldn't do it if you're going to be crossbreeding two different species like a horse and a donkey to create a mule. That's already going too far in the field of animal husbandry. It doesn't produce anything useful, according to the Rambam. I'm not a farmer. I'm not an expert in animal husbandry, so I couldn't tell you whether it's actually beneficial to crossbreed a horse and a donkey. But the Rambam feels that there's no real or significant benefit from it, and therefore, because connected to it is the potential for a person to have sinful thoughts, that's why the Torah prohibits it. And if you remember, I pointed out last week that the Rambam in this chapter uncouples the prohibition of crossbreeding species of plants with the crossbreeding of species of animals. Crossbreeding species of plants may not be done because this is what idolaters did in order to channel certain supernatural powers that they believed existed, but the crossbreeding of animals is prohibited because of its connection to sexual thought. And so it's really quite fascinating. Many other commentaries feel that they are very much related, like the Sefer HaChinuch, and Sefer HaChinuch says that it's got to do with subverting and in some way distorting God's creation. God wants each species to remain separate and distinct, and does not want them to be mixed unnaturally together. And that's why it's prohibited. But the Rambam doesn't believe that. And the Rambam says, I also maintain that this is why the Torah prohibits working with two species of animals, where the Torah says, Lo tacharosh b'shor uvachamor yachdav. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, the Torah says you may not put an ox and a donkey under the same yoke to pull the yoke, even though there may be utility for you. Let's say those are the only two animals you've got on the farm, and you want them to pull the yoke, the Torah prohibits that. Now, the normal understanding is that this is a chok. This is something that has an unintelligible reason, just like the prohibition of mixing wool and linen in your garment. Don't mix two animals. However, the Rambam says, I feel that there's a reason that is related to forbidden sexuality, because what might happen is the two animals might copulate, thus resulting in improper thought for no productive reason. In other words, if I put a male and female bovine animal under the same yoke, they may end up copulating, but that will end up resulting in something productive for the farm. But if I put a donkey and an ox under the same yoke, if they end up copulating, there's no productive end to that. And so therefore, and that might result in sinful thoughts of the observer, of the farmer, and therefore you shouldn't do it. And therefore the Rambam says, my proof for that is that when the Torah prohibits placing the yoke on two different species of animals, it's not specifically oxen and donkeys. It's any two species. And that indicates that there's a broader issue here, which is we don't want two animals mixing together sexually, because this could result in having an adverse effect on the farmers who are working with these animals. We're going to put that aside now. We're going to go on to the mitzvah of Brit Milah. The Rambam has a long treatment on the mitzvah of circumcision in this chapter. Now, one might have put circumcision in a different chapter, just like the Rambam codifies Hilchot Brit Milah completely outside of the law forbidden sexuality in Mishneh Torah, because they're two different functional mitzvot as far as what is practiced. However, thematically, the Rambam feels that the mitzvah of Brit Milah is primarily having to do with curtailing one's sexuality. And how is that accomplished? The ultimate reason for this mitzvah is to bring about a decrease in sexual intercourse and a weakening of the male organ, so that this activity be diminished and the organ be in as dormant a state as possible. Now, the Rambam's thesis is that invariably when you remove the foreskin, you in some way desensitize the male phallus, and as a result, it will diminish man's sexual drive. That's the Rambam's thesis. Not everyone, many commentaries disagree with the Rambam and say it has nothing to do with that, but the Rambam already anticipates his detractors. He says some people believe that the purpose of Brit Milah is to rectify a defect in the human body, but I disagree, because firstly, he says, how can natural things be defective, such that it needs to be externally rectified? And secondly, if anything, the foreskin is a useful appendage to the phallus, because it only enhances the sensitivity of the glands and the remaining skin on the shaft of the phallus that are protected by the foreskin. Now, I'm not going to go into how the Rambam may be medically incorrect based on our knowledge of communicable diseases in the modern world. We're going to put all of that aside for now, because today, most of the medical community would argue in favor of circumcision, because it's been proven, especially in continents like Africa, where HIV and AIDS was running rampant, that male circumcision actually was the biggest contributor to curtailing the transmission of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. So we're going to put that all aside. We're going to, let's say we will grant the Rambam's medical argument that having a foreskin is healthier for the man's organ. But the Rambam, I believe, is philosophically driven to this argument, that it is wrong to suggest that circumcision perfects a natural state in creation. The Rambam is consistent in his view that all of God's creation, by dint of it emanating from God, must be perfect. Recall this argument made by philosophers for an eternal universe in section 2, chapter 14 of the guide. One of the arguments that philosophers, as quoted by the Rambam, had made is that the universe must be eternal because eternality is equivalent to perfection, And since God is perfect, he's eternal. And so therefore anything that emanates from a perfect God must also be perfect. Ergo, the universe must be eternal and not created. Now, so nature is wise and does nothing for naught. That's the term that the Rambam quoted from Aristotle and his school. The world which emanates from a perfect, all-wise, and eternal God must also be perfect, all-wise, and eternal. Now, even though the Rambam rejects the eternality argument of the universe, the assertion that nature is perfect is still something that he subscribes to. He just believes that even within a perfect universe, it is possible for a perfect universe to be created. And we're not going to go rehash that discussion that we had in section 2. That was a very extensive discussion, and you can go listen to the recordings of those earlier presentations. But as it serves our purpose for now, it's very understandable why the Rambam feels that it's incorrect to suggest that the foreskin is an unnecessary appendage that was meant to be removed at birth, and is something, and when you remove it, you perfect an imperfection in a naturally born male. Now, the Rambam, in essence, is rejecting a midrash. And we're certain that the Rambam was aware of this midrash because it's an oft-quoted midrash. It's in Medrash Tanchuma, Parsha Tazria, paragraph number 7. And because of constraints on our time, we'll just mention it outside, that once the wicked Turnus Rufus, who was some kind of Roman general or ruler, asked Rabbi Akiva, who was his opponent. Eventually, Turnus Rufus is identified as Rabbi Akiva's executioner. But before then, when they would have disputations on religious thought, he asked Rabbi Akiva, whose acts are greater, God's or man's? And Rabbi Akiva responded to him by saying, man's acts are greater than God's. So he really completely jostles Turnus Rufus because Turnus Rufus thinks he's going to upend Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva already anticipates what he's about to talk about. So Turnus Rufus says, how could you possibly say that man's acts are greater than God's? And so Rabbi Akiva says, wait here for a minute, comes back with a handful of raw grain and a loaf of bread in the other hand. He says, now which one is more edible and desirable? And Turnus Rufus says, well, obviously the loaf of bread. So you see, so don't you see, says Rabbi Akiva, that man's act of converting the grain through parching the grain, drying it out, grinding it into flour, mixing it with water, making it into a dough, and baking it is greater than God's act of just providing the raw grain. And then Turnus Rufus, without actually attending to that argument, says, why do you Jews circumcise yourselves? And he answers him that that this is what God wants us to do. Why doesn't a child emerge from its mother's womb already circumcised? So Rabbi Akiva answers, Lefi shelo natan HaKadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael et hamitzvot, ela kedei litzaref bahen. Because God wants us to purify the world through the performance of the mitzvot. God wants us to be his partners, as it were, in the performance of the commandments. Here, the Rambam will disagree with the Midrash. He will say that perhaps the Midrash is providing an ethical lesson that is not the real intent of the Torah, but circumcision is not meant to perfect the individual because nature, by virtue of it emanating from God, is already perfect. Now, let's continue. The only thing circumcision perfects is man's potential for moral failing. That the Rambam does acknowledge, that human beings are capable, despite of their being created physically perfect, can have a fall from their natural state, and circumcision will prevent them from falling. In reality, though, injury is caused to the phallus. Physical injury is caused to the phallus, but only in that it subdues man's sexual drive, but does not prevent other bodily functions of that organ. And that's why it's sort of like a safe injury, because it doesn't hinder. When you injure the male organ, you don't prevent it from the male from reproducing, you don't prevent the male from urinating, and therefore it's safe even though it injures and compromises the organ. It is undoubtable, he says, that through circumcision, which involves excising the foreskin and desensitizing the remaining tissue, sexual pleasure is diminished. And that's why our sages taught that when the brothers went to retrieve their sister Dinah in Parshat Vayishlach, where it talks about how Shechem raped Dinah and wanted to keep her as his wife, they had to forcibly extract Dinah because she was so attached to Shechem, because since he was uncircumcised, he had such a powerful sexual passion that she really wanted to stay with him. Because, as the language of the Medrash says, that if a woman has intercourse with an uncircumcised male, it's very hard for her to separate from him because his passions are greater. Now, of course, there's so much social commentary that could be said about this, and we're not going to go there. Witness the fact that the first person to perform this mitzvah was Avraham, who was renowned for his chastity. As our sages state on the verse, that Avraham looks at Sarah after they've been married for many years on their way down to Egypt. In Genesis chapter 12, he says, Hinena yadati ki isha yefat mar'eat. Behold, I notice for the first time that you're a beautiful woman. And the Talmud in Bava Batra reflects on this, and it says that you see from here that Avraham was extremely modest and chaste. And why was that? Because since he circumcised himself, he diminished his sexual appetite and was able actually to create that diminished passion for wanting to look at his wife and indulge in her beauty. Very problematic, because in Judaism, we don't sort of emphasize this idea that the Rambam is talking about. In Judaism, in modern Judaism, we generally preach that sex between a husband and a wife is a beautiful thing. It's something to be enjoyed and indulged in. And the idea that in some way our practice of circumcision diminishes the sex drive is not something that we would want to promote as sort of being our best selling point as to why be Jewish. But nonetheless, the Rambam feels that this is actually something laudable. It is a virtue that Judaism has a mechanism to minimize the sexual drive so that man can focus his attention on the main objective of life, which is intellectual perfection. Then the Rambam tells us the second reason for Brit Milah, which is unrelated to the curtailment of man's sexual drive, but rather that it is a sign of a special covenant among a group of people. All those who share the same religious belief, that is the unity of God, share a bodily sign that unites them. This helps to weed out the fraudsters who would join the Jewish people for personal benefit, for ulterior motives, without accepting the religion itself. Because circumcision is a difficult thing to do, it will prevent perpetrators of fraud from entering the community. Furthermore, when people share a common sign on the body, this creates unity and community among those with that commonality. This then is a sign of a joint covenant made by a community of people who accept Hashem as their God. This reason is at least as strong as the first, and possibly even stronger, that circumcision is like a brand or a medal or some kind of insignia that a group of people who are part of the same club or the same fraternity all proudly share in common. And that creates sort of a strengthening of the religious cohesiveness of the Jewish people. So that's a completely different reason, having nothing to do with sexuality. Then the Rambam asks the question, well, why is circumcision specifically commanded to be performed on an 8-day-old infant? Why not do it immediately upon birth, and why not wait a little bit longer before performing circumcision, like Muslims, many of whom perform circumcision at the age of 13 years old? The reason this mitzvah succeeded and took hold is because it is performed on a newborn infant, says the Rambam, and there are 3 reasons for this. Number one, if you told a child that, when you grow up, this is a mitzvah that you have to do yourself, many Jewish children would never bother circumcising themselves because it's too painful. Number 2, a child's foreskin and nerve endings are not well formed at this young age, and thus it is not as painful of a procedure on a neonate. And that's something that's been clearly demonstrated even in modern medicine. Furthermore, the mental agony is also diminished, since newborns do not have a developed imagination. They're not scared of what's about to happen, and therefore the pain is far less. Because as we know, part of the pain of any painful procedure, whether it be surgery or a bee sting or whatever it is the preliminary fear of the incoming, the foreboding pain that's about to occur. And reason number 3, so that's, again, reason number 1 is because if you let a child do it on his own recognizance, many would not do it. Number 2, and that's why you do it with an infant. Number 2, a child at that age doesn't have the mental or physical development yet to feel full pain. And number three, the love between parents and children intensifies as the child gets older. Because the child is a newborn, the parent's love has not fully intensified, making it easier for the father to submit his child to a painful procedure. And just to quote the language, for this imaginative form increases through habitual contact and grows with the growth of the child. In other words, what the Rambam is suggesting is that when children grow up in their parents' home, there's a love that intensifies. I love my 1-year-old baby much more than I love my newborn infant. I love my 2-year-old child even more than I loved him when he was 1-year-old. I love him more when he's 3, etc. And therefore, if we were to allow parents to wait a little bit longer, to defer circumcision until the baby was 1-year-old or 2 years old, the parents' love that has increased by that time would have perhaps prevented them from allowing their child to be subjected to a painful procedure. However, when the child is young like this, and he's a newborn, the parents, certainly this could be said about the father upon whom the mitzvah is, the father hasn't developed a full attachment and love to this child yet, and therefore it's a bit easier for him to submit him to the moil and tell him, go ahead and do what you need to do. The Rambam, in the course of saying that, says something that I found fascinating. He says that the love between a parent and a child intensifies as the child gets over, and then he says, then it begins to decrease and disappear. Now, that's not related to the mitzvah of Brit Milah, but I just find it a fascinating commentary that the Rambam makes, is that parents, as they see their children get older, the love intensifies, but at some point it peaks and then it starts to diminish. Perhaps it's when your kid is a teenager and he wrecks your favorite car or something to that effect. I'm speaking in jest. But the point is that as our children leave the nest and they become self-sufficient adults, the love always remains, but it is not as intense as it was when they were our children growing up in our own home. And we could spend a lot of time just discussing that, but we are short on time, so let's get finished with the chapter. The reason why specifically on the 8th day and not on the 7th day or the 9th day, the Rambam says before the 8th day, a neonate is still not fully developed and is very weak to the point where it's almost as if the child is still in the womb for the first week. We see this to be the case with animals as well, which is why the Torah states about the acceptability of a newborn animal as a sacrifice, Shivat Yamim Yihya Imimo. You may not use an animal for a sacrifice until the 8th day of its life, because then it's considered to be a completely viable animal. Same thing is true. You don't want to circumcise a child or perform a surgical procedure on a child who is so delicate because that's his state before the 8th day. Although neonates develop differently, we need a fixed number of days, which is how halacha is structured. That because, some children may develop faster, some may develop slower, some, clearly humans are different from animals, but the Torah gives us a fixed number. 8 days is the time from which both animals and humans are considered to be strong enough to be able to endure this kind of procedure. The prohibition against neutering animals and not allowing eunuchs to marry, the Rambam puts in the same category. Just as the Torah wishes to diminish focusing on sexuality, it does not wish to eliminate it entirely, but instead seeks to moderate it and temper it. Did not the Torah, after all, give us a commandment of to be fruitful and multiply? So God doesn't want us to eliminate sexual appetite and sexual activity altogether. He just wants it to be moderated and not the primary focus and not the obsession of the human being. And for this reason, the Torah prohibits neutering male animals, because the Torah doesn't wish to completely eliminate the husbandry of animals, the conjoining and the copulation of animals. The Torah just wishes to limit sexual behavior, but not to completely eliminate it. And so in the animal kingdom, it is completely forbidden to do that to an animal, eliminating its possibility of procreating. Now, as far as whether or not there's a biblical prohibition of spaying a female animal, that's a halachic discussion that is well beyond the confines of our discussion. But suffice it for now that I note that even though there may not be a biblical prohibition of spaying a female animal, there is nonetheless a rabbinic prohibition of spaying a female animal as well. And this is consistent with circumcision, which merely subdues man's sexual drive but doesn't eliminate it entirely. And that, for the same reason, it is forbidden for a man whose sexual organs have been damaged to marry. That's why the Torah calls it a pitzua daka and a churut shofcha. Pitzua daka, where the testicles are crushed, and churut shofcha, where the organ of the phallus itself has been damaged in some way, not allowing sperm to emit from the male organ to impregnate a woman. So reason number one, says the Rambam, because such a sexual union does not have any utility and is completely gratuitous. Here, the Rambam seems to be clearly saying that it cannot result in procreation. And reason number two, such a marriage will potentially be a stumbling block for the wife, because it's unlikely that her husband will be able to sexually gratify her because of his diminished sexual ability to perform. And therefore, it's going to cause her to stray, and it will cause her adulterer to stray as well. Next category, the mamzer, and that's our last category of discussion for the laws of sexuality. The reason why the Torah says that a mamzer, which is a bastard, a product of a forbidden sexual union of incest or adultery, is not allowed to marry a regular Jewish woman, is to teach adulterers that their crime will have an indelible negative impact on their offspring. This is a further disincentive of having people commit incest and adultery. Furthermore, all religions view the mamzer negatively, and certainly the seed of Israel is too noble to mix with bastards. So there's something inherent, the Rambam says, within human society, not just in the Torah, that places a stigma on children who are born out of so to speak, an evil union of a man and a woman. The Kohen, who is of higher nobility, is not only restricted from marrying a mamzer, but he may not marry a prostitute, that is a woman who has had loose sexual activity with non-Jews, a divorcee, or a halala, which is a woman who was born from a prohibited union between a Kohen and a woman that he's not allowed to marry. The high priest is further restricted in that he may not marry any non-virgin. Being that mamzers are forbidden, it follows that male and female slaves certainly are forbidden to consort with Jews. And finally, the Rambam says the reason for the ban on intermarriage is explicit in the Torah. God does not want Jewish men to marry non-Jewish women and vice versa, because it will result in assimilation to their religion. They will use idolatry and turn the Jew away from the service of God. So that's quite clear, nothing to do with sexual curtailment or anything like that, but clearly it's going to cause the Jew to stray away from his religion. And here, the last section of this chapter is where the Rambam basically gives his conclusion of the 14 categories of mitzvot, which basically categorized all 613 commandments. There are some chukim, there are some unintelligible of the 613 commandments, I grant you, whose reasons are unknown to us. But in all those cases, they were given to distance us from idolatrous practices. The reason I personally, the Rambam, doesn't understand them is because the practice that they were supposed to deter have long been abolished and are far from an ancient from an ancient time that is lost to us. In other words, they're from a completely different era. I don't understand what was going on back then, and that's why I can't understand why certain mitzvot were given to us. Even though I refer to the Sabaeans' practices because I have a book from the Sabaean times, my book knowledge is not comparable to one who has seen these things with his own eyes. Especially in areas of sacrificial laws and laws of purity and impurity, I have no doubt that the laws were given to eliminate those senseless practices of idolaters from a bygone era. These idolatrous practices deterred people from proper thinking and practice. As the prophet says, Jeremiah, he says in chapter 2, Ve'acharei lo yo'ilu halachu. They follow things that are completely senseless. Or as he says in chapter 16, Vayomru ach sheker nachalu avotenu. The other nations will say that our ancestors provided us with a heritage of absolute falsehood that is of no use. And then just a quote from Pines, every commandment or prohibition of the Torah whose reason is hidden from you constitutes a cure for one of those diseases of thinking, which today, thank God, we do not know anymore. I now conclude this discussion of all the commandments by category and have explained their reasons. There are only a few and some slight details for which I have not given reasons, even though in truth, we have virtually given reasons also for these to him who is attentive and comprehending. In other words, the Rambam concludes by saying that if you read this commentary of the last 14 chapters carefully, you'll be able to extrapolate and be able to conclude reasonable reasons or a logic behind the entire system of each one of the 613 commandments. even the ones whose reasons are lost to us, you'll at least be able to extrapolate that there must have been something in ancient civilization that was unhealthy for man in his goal of reaching intellectual perfection, and that's why that mitzvah was given. And it's with this that we're going to conclude our presentation for today. I know it's a lot to swallow, but I wanted to finish this before Rosh Hashanah. Next week, when we do have our class during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, we will do chapter 50, and that will finish most of the third section of the guide, leaving us with chapters 51 to 54 to do after the Chagim, because that's a whole different discussion which we need to spend significant time on, several weeks, and really, really try and attack it very, very carefully and delicately. Let me wish you all a ketiva v'chatima tova. Let us see tremendous blessing, especially in the land of Israel for the year 5785. Let's bring our hostages home quickly. Victory for all of Am Yisrael. Wishing you all the best, and we'll see you next time.